I want to start off this review by stating that I was very much excited for this film. I saw the trailer for the first time on Twitter where someone was praising it for how refreshing it felt in terms of horror, and after watching that trailer, I felt the exact same way. I can't deny that this film has some of the best advertising I've ever seen for any film. The fourth trailer they released, titled "You've Got the Teeth of the Hydra Upon You," reminds me a lot of the original Alien trailer, which is also one of the best film trailers of all time. The most important part of these trailers, however, was that it barely shows Longlegs, at the very most only showing the bottom half of his face. Instead, we only hear him and his cryptic voice. You can definitely still tell that it's Nicolas Cage when you hear him, but it just feels different. In Dirty Part 2, his voice sounds frantic, volatile, unnerving. I was just so impressed with how much restraint the trailer has had. I feel like if Blumhouse Productions made this film, they would have shown Longlegs in the closing shot of the first trailer, then flooded the rest of the advertisements with his face as the focal point. Instead, Neon did the smart thing, the right thing, to hide his appearance until the premiere of the film. So TLDR, Longlegs' marketing team gets an A for their performance. They did an unbelievable job. It would be an A+, but I have one criticism with it, which will come later. Sadly, the film itself kinda sucks dick. I'm capping, but I can't deny that the film nowhere near matches that level of brilliance, which is honestly very disappointing. Before I get into my criticisms of the film, I want to talk about what I enjoyed, because I don't want it to seem like it was a complete and utter dumpster fire of a film, because it wasn't. First, the cinematography and sound design of the film are great. I feel like those are the two things you have to nail down if you want to make an effective horror movie. That doesn't mean you gotta turn everything up to 11, but you gotta understand when to turn it down and when to bring it up. You gotta have that restraint. Personally, I feel like the use of wider angles made for a more unsettling watch. It constantly made me feel like something was gonna happen in the background. The lighting also felt very appropriate for the tone the film was going for. Nothing felt overexposed, and thankfully it never felt underexposed. Sounds were also top-notch, although there were some faults with this, which I will also discuss later, but overall, it worked. Honestly, I want to say, for more than half of the film, I felt it was pretty great, on the verge of being amazing. It reminded me of those classic crime thrillers, the ones director Oz Perkins drew inspirations from, specifically Silence of the Lambs. Although it of course was nowhere near that film, Longlegs was deeply engrossing to watch. Just from the opening scene, I was immediately hooked. It was just the perfect way to open the film. The imagery was very stimulating, which I think helped add to the creepiness of the film. There are also just random pop-ins of images that reminded me a lot like the opening of Seven. I wish I could comment on what the images were, but they were just so fast I couldn't make out what they were. But the reason why the opening works so well is because of Nick Cage as Longlegs. Honestly, I was a bit taken aback to see him so early in the film. I was under the impression that they would pull a 7 and hide him until the third act, but no, they show him right off the bat, but only his body. Like the trailers, we get a quick glimpse of his face at the end of the scene, but it cuts off before you can get a clean look at him. The blur that covers his face almost disfigures it, further creating an image of mystery and fear of Longlegs. Nicolas Cage's performance really is the highlight of this film. The makeup on him is incredible. It's practically impossible to tell it's him behind it, and it's genuinely unnerving watching his character on screen. Sadly, however, this is where my praises of the film end. Staying on the topic of Longlegs, I felt the film deviated from the allure of hiding him after the opening. There are points in the film, very early on mind you, where we see him just existing. It's really weird to watch, honestly. I think it's generally a good idea to have these kinds of scenes, as we get a chance to watch how these characters deal with the mundane parts of life. Here it's awkward because it directly goes against the marketing team's plan of concealing Longlegs' identity, which is my one fault of the marketing. In a sense, it feels a bit like false advertising. The closest example I can think of is It Comes at Night. I felt the film was marketed as a crime thriller kind of horror when, in reality, the film delves more into supernatural horror, or at least more than I expected. I'm not really into supernatural horror at all. I find it almost always completely unscary, so surprise surprise, I didn't find this film scary, like at all. Yeah, I know, I'm a badass. Like I said in my war video, the films I find the most horrifying are those in the war genre because they're the most grounded and real. Now, this film did make me jump, but for the wrong reason. This film uses a lot more jump scares than I hoped for. I think it could be an effective way to scare the audience, but you have to use it smartly and, most importantly, sparingly. If the audience expects a jump scare, it loses all of its effectiveness. But you have to build up to it. It can't be cheap and out of nowhere. There was one in the film that just came out of nowhere, so naturally I did jump at it. It's just frustrating to watch the film rely on cheap shots like that when it was doing great without it. felt like I was James Harden getting elbowed in the head by Metal World Peace. Like, what the hell, man? Like, why did you do that? I'm also on the fence on the main character, Lee Harker. I think my criticisms revolve more around Lee as a character rather than Micah Monroe's performance, but she just felt way too robotic for me to latch onto her as a character. Pretty sure that was the intent the writers had, but it just feels too empty for me to care about her. I just kept thinking about Agent Starling and how we got to see her make it through the FBI training because of her resilience and effort. We experienced the struggle she experiences, and in the end, it feels all the more rewarding to see her make it and solve the Buffalo Bill case. Longlegs, this aspect is missing, and the explanation as to why this is the case is pretty stupid. The ending of this film is also just incredibly disappointing and genuinely not good. It felt incredibly rushed and absolutely nonsensical. It makes sense in the context of the film, but there should have been more time to flesh out those ideas. I genuinely didn't expect the film to go that direction, and I genuinely wish it didn't. I feel a big reason as to why I was so let down from this film was because of people comparing it to Silence of the Lambs, a film leagues above Longlegs. It was the reason I watched the film, and I think it's the reason I was disappointed with it. But I think a film that's a better comparison to it is Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Cure. Honestly, I was hoping to be the first person to make this comparison, but sadly Chris Stuckman beat me to it. Thankfully he's one of the GOATs, so that's gotta be a good sign, right? Anyways, the film revolves around a central serial killer who doesn't actually kill anyone, just like Longlegs. Basically like a Manson. But unlike Longlegs, this film is just more grounded, more believable. I haven't seen the film in a while, and it's one of those that I'd like to discuss further another time, so I'll keep it short. Just, if you expected more of a crime horror in Longlegs and were left disappointed, I'd highly recommend Cure. There's one scene that I think perfectly explains my frustrations with this film, that being a 911 call in the first chapter of the film. This was actually used as one of the advertisements titled, "Every Year There Is Another," in which the man shown in the family picture frantically calls 911. At first he explains to the dispatcher that it's his daughter that's the issue, then explaining that it's not his daughter, implying that his daughter's been replaced or something along those lines. Honestly, I don't understand why Perkins added this to the film. If it was to up the hysteria of the case, the horror of it, it would have made more sense to use a different perspective. So instead of having the father, the killer call, it should have been the daughter or mother. That way, it would have had a bigger fear factor considering they're the ones being hunted. The call was instead used to up the mystery surrounding the case, that being who's the real danger in this situation. I feel like having both the 911 call from the daughter and father would have made more sense. That way there's a contrast between opinions, creating that uncertainty of who's truthful and who's not. The call also just falls short of replicating a real 911 call. Despite what I've said before, I really am a big fan of horror content. Staying on topic, there are many videos on YouTube that discuss real cases that include real calls from victims. Just listening to these, you can feel the hysteria and hopelessness in their voices. It really is quite scarring, and sadly, most of these calls result in death. In short, the 911 call in Longlegs nowhere near reaches that level of horror, realism that I would have hoped for, as it just sounds fake and forced. In the end, my thoughts on this film reflect my thoughts on this scene. Wasted potential.